Donald Trump and DOGE's massive government layoffs were just put on a 14-day pause by this following Bill Clinton appointed judge. Susan Ilston, who was appointed by Bill Clinton in 1995 based out of San Francisco, California, who initially had a career focusing on intellectual property matters and a lot of commercial litigation, has just shut down Donald Trump, suggesting that Donald Trump, the Office of Personnel Management, and DOGE have all exceeded their constitutional authority. Now, all of this has to do with the following executive order, 14210. This is Donald Trump's Department of Governmental Efficiency Workforce Optimization Initiative. And it's basically designed to fire a bunch of people in the government. That's just the simplest way to put this. If you scroll down a little bit, you can get some more details of the actual executive order. In Section 3, it requires various different agencies to submit plans to reduce size of the federal government workforce. By the way, these would be plans drafted up by the Office of Personnel Management and Budget. This actually ends up being an important part of the case, so keep this in the back of your mind. And the plan requires that each agency hire no more than one employee for every 4 that leave. And there's a federal hiring freeze. So in other words, you can't expand. And if you fire 4 people, maybe we'll let you hire 1 to replace the 4 you fired. Each agency head shall also develop a plan that is a data-driven plan in consultation with their DOGE team lead, and they should focus hiring only on areas that are mission critical, basically essential government services. So this executive order is the crux of what's being frozen and ordered in a 42-ish page briefing from the judge, or order from the briefing, demanding a 14-day injunction that no plans for firings or agency layoffs should be conducted, that there is essentially going to be a temporary restraining order eliminating the opportunity for this to continue. Now, what I want to do is go through some of the juice in the actual order, and I'll tell you, there's a lot of it. It's going to give you a lot of perspective into what's going on. Now, keep in mind, I don't really have a horse at all in this race. I think the government definitely has some efficiency driving it needs to do. But it is interesting nonetheless to see the president push the limits of what a president can do and the judicial system try at least to rein him in. I expect tomorrow we'll get a lot of Truth Social posts about how judges and activist judges are trying to limit the president's ability to do what he wants to do and do what he was, essentially voted into power to do. At least that's what the president's team argues. And so we'll see how it evolves. Maybe it'll end up at the Supreme Court. But for now, here are some of the things that we'll find. Any president must enlist the help of their co-equal branch and partner, the Congress. I find this is actually an interesting phrase. The judge is basically saying Congress is your equal and you need to use them, and it is not the responsibility of courts to micromanage the federal workforce. But sometimes courts need to act to preserve the proper checks and balances between the 3 branches of government, and that unchecked presidential power is not what the framers had in mind, the framers of the Constitution. And so there's a 2-week pause being started now, unless of course they can get the legislative branch involved, and that's what the judge is trying to do, protect the power of the legislative branch. They give some examples of problems here. They say that agencies like OSHA wanted to fire 221 mine safety workers, so basically people who verify that mines in America are safe, and there are only 222 workers in total, so we would basically fire all of them except 1. They give other examples over Social Security or housing and urban development or childcare staffing offices that have essentially been shuttered because of a lack of federal funds available to keep operating, leading to potentially farmers missing their planting windows for emergency relief claims, or the Social Security Administration having reduced its workforce or trying to reduce its workforce by 7,000 people, leading to long waits and people very frustrated or unable to make appointments with Social Security. Those are just some of the examples that they give in terms of why they think a temporary restraining order would be necessary to preserve the function of government. Of course, there are many other, they mention at least that the court received over 1,000 different submissions of complaints about how the government basically wasn't able to function anymore because of the lack of staffing. Now, the judge outlines that the executive order from the president commences a critical transformation of the federal bureaucracy, and quotes the president in saying that tax dollars are being siphoned off to fund unproductive, unnecessary programs that benefit radical interest groups while hurting hardworking Americans. And that's why these layoffs need to happen. But the judge finds that DOGE, known as the Department of Governmental Efficiency, derives no authority from law at all. So this is actually a really big dig at DOGE from a judge here saying, you have no legal authority to do anything. Now, what's also interesting is the judge references how many workers are supposed to be fired from some various different departments and gives some examples. The Department of Health and Human Services is issuing reduction in force notices of 8,000 to 10,000 employees. 8,500 positions might be cut from the Department of Energy, which is nearly half of the workforce. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which deals obviously with weather or hurricane forecasting and otherwise, is reportedly preparing a reduction in work to reduce its workforce by more than half. Reports also suggest that Housing and Urban Development is prepared to cut half of its staff and close many field offices. The Department of Labor Management said internally that they have intended to cut the agency's headquarters staff by 70%, and the IRS plans to cut 40%, keeping in mind that about 31% of auditors have already been cut for tax auditing purposes, and the VA is planning to cut 83,000 positions. All of these just being referenced here by the judge. And when we get into sort of this history of precedent, the judge says that what Donald Trump's executive order 14.210 is doing is usurping the power of congressional authority in violation of the Constitution's separation of powers clause, and that the Office of Personnel Management, DOGE, and other agencies are operating beyond their authority and are violating Administrative Procedures Acts in the process of doing what they're doing. In other words, they're violating the law and they don't have any leg to stand on anyway. And those are some of the reasons why, at least, the judge is providing this temporary restraining order. We then get into standing, but we also get into some historical precedent where we actually find not only that the judge suggests the court finds that at least some of the plaintiff's arguments will be substantial enough to potentially succeed, and therefore they're providing this preliminary injunction. But it's also worth noting that the judge looks at history and says, hey, in the past, other presidents, Herbert Hoover or other presidents, have asked Congress for the right to go back and reduce the expanded administrative state. So basically, you ask Congress for permission and you expressly get permission to broadly restructure federal agencies. And this was done by Herbert Hoover, who first requested and received such authority. Congress granted his authority 16 times under both Republican and Democratic administrations, or granted this authority, not just to Herbert Hoover, but to others, to include 9 different presidents. So in other words, 9 different presidents have had the right by Congress to provide for some form of administrative reorganization. However, George Bush and Obama, I believe it was, off the top of my head, asked and were denied of their opportunity. Yeah, here, Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump in his first term all sought but did not end up getting congressional approval to reorganize the executive branch and those administrative facilities. And so the judge is essentially saying, hey, you guys tried and failed. It used to work in the past, but now you're all failing, and your legislation to try to get Congress to help you failed. And so this is very simple. You can't do this alone. In fact, they say the following. The simple proposition that the president may not, without Congress, fundamentally reorganize federal agencies is not controversial. Constitutional commenters and politicians across party lines agree that sweeping reorganization of the federal bureaucracy requires the active participation of Congress. So the judge here is not mincing words. This is actually a pretty scathing report or order rather, and it goes all the way back to when Bill Clinton lost his line item veto powers, which basically say, hey, Congress has the power to spend and the president does not without the power of Congress. And so if you want to reorganize the federal government, that's fine, but you need to do it with the work of Congress. This is obviously going to be very difficult for Donald Trump, given that they have just enough of a majority to, via budget reconciliation, squeeze a tax bill through Congress, which they likely will do this year. But that'll be done along party lines. It'll have a lot of negotiating components to it. But something like this, or really any kind of other legislation that would require a normal 60 votes to get through a filibuster, probably not going to happen without significant Democratic support. In other words, some form of bipartisanship. And I think that's why Donald Trump, since he failed in term 1, is trying in term 2 to just do it via DOGE and executive order. But this judge is shutting down some of these layoffs, at least temporarily. Now, in the near term, this is probably not going to help much with reducing uncertainty. But what you actually might get is fewer government layoffs, which would lead to fewer potential unemployment concerns for the broader economy, which I think is actually important for a soft landing to make sure we don't go into some kind of hard landing, layoff-induced recession. Not saying we don't want governmental efficiency, but I am simply arguing that there could actually be an upside to this from an economic point of view. Obviously, the downside would be fiscal, right? Now we're spending more money and not necessarily getting as much efficiency as we were hoping. DOGE, therefore, could not have been acting pursuant to statutory authority in ordering large-scale workforce reductions. Why? Because they have no legal authority at all. This is pretty scathing. I mean, this San Francisco judge is tearing apart Donald Trump's executive order and DOGE. So this is borderline destruction by this judge for the initiatives that Donald Trump is trying to pull in terms of reorganizing these agencies and firing people. Now, the judge also separates what the power of Congress is and what the power of the executive is. The judge goes on to say that these individuals are likely to succeed on their claims, the claiming parties, the nonprofits, the state agencies and other agencies and unions that are suing on the behalf of these workers. Additionally, the judge writes, holding that the president, DOGE, the Office of Personnel Management and Budget, have exceeded their authority naturally raises the question of precisely where the line should be drawn between executive and legislative authority. Okay, so basically, where's the line? And the interesting response is, we don't even need to tell you where the line is. It is enough today to say that this action is surely beyond the line. And she basically invokes Chief Justice John Roberts in her order to say, hey, Trump and DOGE are going way too far. We're shutting this down. Therefore, it is hereby ordered temporary injunction. Now, obviously, the Supreme Court might eventually end up getting looped into this, and we might end up finding changes to these sort of orders. Again, this is just a temporary injunction at the moment here. But at least in this particular court, this is a U.S. district judge, this judge is mincing absolutely zero words in this Northern District of California. This is a federal court. And at least until there is another court that steps in on this, this is going to be the rule for the next 2 weeks. Those layoffs are on hold. It's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. If you want to learn more, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to make sure you don't miss a notification, download the Meet Kevin app in the App Store on Android and Apple. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Goodbye and good luck.
Why not advertise these things that you told us here? I feel like nobody else knows about this.
We'll try a little advertising and see how it goes.
Congratulations, man. You have done so much. People love you. People look up to you.
Kevin Paffrath there, financial analyst and YouTuber. Meet Kevin. Always great to get your take.